A critical North Carolina Supreme Court election is going to a recount, and Republicans are up to their tricks trying to disqualify tens of thousands of voters. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started. Incumbent Democratic Justice Allison Riggs has won re-election to the North Carolina Supreme Court by just 625 votes. Riggs is a former voting rights attorney who was appointed to the North Carolina High Court last year by Governor Roy Cooper. Her Republican challenger is a state appeals court judge named Jefferson Griffin. Now, Marc, on election night, Griffin was leading by over 10,000 votes. But once all the votes were cast and counted, Riggs came out on top. How did we get from there to here?
Yeah, so, this is a good lesson for people because we are so quick on election night to want to know who won that oftentimes the picture of what things look like change, right? And they don't change because of anything nefarious. They don't change because of anything suspicious. They change because not all of the ballots are counted on election night. Even in states where they have called the outcome of the election, you still have things changing. For example, Paige, in the presidential election, it felt like a very early night, that Donald Trump had won some large mandate. It turns out as the ballots now are being counted in all of these states, that margin is growing smaller and smaller. Now, it doesn't mean that he didn't win, and it doesn't mean that he won't be sworn in as the 47th president, but it does mean that you have to wait to see exactly what the margins are. And in close elections, like this one in North Carolina for state Supreme Court justice, that margin can flip. And again, Republicans try to make a lot of hay out of this, that, why is it that in one state or another, or one district or another, you see Democrats gain votes as the counting goes on? That is oftentimes the result of the fact that more Democrats are still voting by mail than Republicans are. So you tend to see, as those last mail-in ballots get counted, Democrats pick up some vote. Also, oftentimes in more urban areas, it takes a little longer to count the ballots, so there's more of a backlog. But this is totally normal. This has been a very, very long and laborious process in North Carolina, Paige. I mean, this has already been more than a week since election day, so it's taken a while to get through all of this. So people can have confidence that this first count, this complete count of the ballots is accurate as we now go into the recount, which is, of course, the next phase of all of this.
Right, Marc. And to your point, the North Carolina State Board of Election put out guidance saying that all the votes wouldn't be in on election night. And in their first batch of unofficial results reported then, it would miss huge quantities of ballots. They said election night results would not include absentee ballots that were returned on election day. It wouldn't include provisional ballots. And really importantly, it wouldn't include all of the military and overseas ballots in North Carolina, since those votes have an extended deadline to make it back to the state. Now,
and it's interesting, Paige, because we saw a lot of litigation in the run up to this election. We saw a lot of litigation in the run up to this election in North Carolina. And one of the themes we saw over and over again from state to state, as well as in North Carolina, were Republicans trying to disenfranchise these military and overseas voters, and even more broadly, trying to disenfranchise people who cast vote by mail. Well, here now you understand why the Republicans were up to the no good tactics that they were up to, because they knew that if they disenfranchise voters in close elections, it might benefit them. And thankfully, for all of the troubles and tribulations that we have in democracy right now, for all of the concerns that people have about the courts, this is an example of where, more often than not, the courts did their job and protected voting rights. And the best way for those of you out there who want to stay up to date on what is happening to democracy in court, to what is happening in these recounts, to what is happening as the parties in North Carolina, around the country, try to deal with the increased challenges to democracy. Best way to stay on top of that is to subscribe to Democracy Docket. The link is in the show notes below. And if you want to become a premium member and get even more content, to become a paid member of Democracy Docket, and that link is in the show notes below as well.
Griffin has requested a recount in the race, which is his right as a candidate in a close race like this. He can request a recount. But along with the recount, Griffin and the state Republican Party are challenging the validity of over 60,000 ballots cast this November in North Carolina. Marc, what claims are they making?
Huh. What claims are they making? They're claiming that they don't want these ballots to count because they think it's going to help them win the election, right? I mean, Republicans don't really need an excuse to disenfranchise voters. It is one of the most disturbing things about where we are in democracy today is that we just kind of like accept the fact that, well, yeah, Republicans are challenging 60,000 votes in North Carolina, and they must be doing it for partisan advantage, and they've concocted some cockamamie theory about fraud or irregularities. And of course, that's just kind of like baked in the cake. And we have normalized it in a way that is really, really problematic for democracy, but which, as I pointed out, so far the courts have stood up to. So they are going to do everything they can to try to disenfranchise the votes of people who they believe, or now in many instances know, because the ballots have been open, voted for Justice Riggs. And they will make up reasons. They will come up with every technicality. Look, Paige, at what we have seen going on in places like Pennsylvania, where there's also been post-election activity, and where Republicans have been very quick to say no recount, there shouldn't be a recount, there shouldn't be any challenges, and have been trying to nevertheless throw out people's ballots on all kinds of technicalities. Well, that's the same kind of stuff we see here in North Carolina, except now they want the recount, right? So they are outcome determinative. Their decision about whether or not there should be a recount or shouldn't be a recount is entirely based on whether they are ahead or behind. But the one thing that unifies them across all of these states, Paige, is their desire to throw out votes. While Democrats fight to make sure that everyone's vote counts, Republicans in time after time, in race after race, are in court, are at these canvassing boards fighting to throw out votes.
And Marc, like you said, Republicans filed lawsuits before the election to disqualify voters. In North Carolina alone, the RNC filed a lawsuit challenging the voter registrations of over 225,000 voters in the state. They're now challenging 60,000 voters in the state. So election officials now having to do a recount in the race also have to consider these voter challenges. And what does that process all look like?
Look, first, the North Carolina State Board of Elections is going to meet and go over these challenges. That process has already begun, right? That is already literally underway as we are recording this video. And that I think will do away with a lot of these challenges. I think the North Carolina State Board of Elections is gonna really sort of clear out the underbrush of a lot of this nonsense that we're seeing. But look, the recount is starting, and so we're going to be going day to day here, watching this going on, and Democracy Docket will be reporting it. What's happening with these challenges, what's happening with things that come up during the recount. The one thing about recounts is there's always something that happens that you kind of scratch your head and you're like, hadn't seen that before. So make sure you're paying attention to what's going on Democracy Docket. And hey, Paige, I noticed you guys have a new account on Blue Sky, and it is something. And I'm following you. You're in my starter pack. And so I hope everyone takes a second to also make sure they're following you on Blue Sky.
Yeah, Marc, I noticed I had to scroll all the way to the bottom of your starter pack to find Democracy Docket listed there, just for your awareness. But we are on Blue Sky. We heard y'all's cause. You asked us to be there. So we're there now. We're posting all of our updates there like we are on all of our other social media channels. So if you're on Blue Sky, give us a follow. Marc, we have talked at length over the past few years about how politicized the North Carolina State Supreme Court has become. They moved from nonpartisan elections to partisan elections. So you now have judges and justices running with explicit D's and R's after their name. We talked about how when the court switched from a Democratic majority to a Republican majority, almost immediately, and by almost immediately, we mean within weeks and within a couple months, they reversed a lot of pro-voting decisions that banned partisan gerrymandering, that reversed a ruling striking down a voter ID law for being racially discriminatory. Now, in your opinion, does turning the courts into another partisan arena in our political process harm the judiciary? And does it really do any good for voters or for plaintiffs who are bringing cases in those courts?
Look, I've been very, very clear, and we've talked about this before. The fact that North Carolina's legislature, its Republican-dominated legislature, moved from nonpartisan elections for judges to explicitly partisan elections for judges, made no sense and is bad for democracy. Like it is not a good thing. Most courts are actually moving in the opposite direction. There's been a trend away from partisan identifiers for judicial candidates towards nonpartisan courts. Even better still is to do away with elections for judges, but that's a story for another episode. But when you're going to have elections, it is better to not have them run explicitly as partisans. But that's the decision that the Republicans in North Carolina made because they thought it would benefit them. And it has, Paige. I mean, let's be honest. This was a left of center court that when the Republican legislature in North Carolina changed this has now become a 5-2 court. And make no mistake, I have been very critical of this court and its rulings, but there is a big difference between a 5-2 court and a 6-1 court. A 5-2 court still sets it up in future years to build on that and build on a win here for Justice Riggs to restore more balance. If this goes 6-1 and all of the indications at that point are that's just the way the court's going to be, I tell you this: the court's not going to become more pro-democracy, and it's going to be harder to turn that in future years. So this is a very big election. This is a very important recount for people to be following because this is a state that just elected a Democratic governor. This is a state that notwithstanding the gerrymandering in the legislature, is a very, very closely divided state. This was a close battleground state. Even though Kamala Harris came up short, it was not by that much. So it is important that people pay attention to this, as I mentioned, by following Democracy Docket and all of its work and subscribing to its newsletters. But no, I don't think it's a good thing that the Republicans in North Carolina have tried to make these court elections more partisan.
And I think people tend to forget that even though a state Supreme Court only has jurisdiction over its own state, what happens in one of those courts can affect the entire country. Remember, Moore v. Harper and the independent state legislature theory came out of a case that went before the North Carolina State Supreme Court about partisan gerrymandering in the states. Now, it was Republicans who took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, but we're a country. Not everything happens in a bubble. Everything is connected. What happens in North Carolina may affect voters in Texas or California or New York down the line. Now, Marc, you alluded to this a little earlier that you have been involved in a lot of recounts before. You have a lot of experience in this arena. What do you think happens in North Carolina?
Look, you always have to assume that the status quo is the most likely outcome. Now, it's not always the outcome. I've been involved in recounts that have reversed the status quo outcome. What do I mean by status quo outcome? The first count, right? So more often than not, the first count will prove out to be affirmed in recounts, but there are instances where that is not the case. And I've been involved in reversing elections that came out one way in the first count and then flipped. So, this is a very close election. The thing I would keep your eye on is whether the Republicans are able to take these challenges that, as I mentioned earlier, are literally being heard by the State Board of Elections while we're recording this, whether they find a way to bring these to state court, right? Whether they find a way to get the state court system, which we just described as right now controlled by Republicans, involved. It would be a terrible thing for the state courts of North Carolina to put a thumb on the scale. It would be a terrible thing. But, we have seen a lot of terrible things come out of courts sometimes. So we'll be watching, we'll be paying attention, and we're not going to let that happen without everybody watching this video and everyone who subscribes to Democracy Docket knowing about it. Because to quote a newspaper that has not lived up to its motto in this moment, democracy dies in darkness. And we are not going to let darkness prevail here or in any other corner of democracy. The fact is that I founded Democracy Docket in 2020 to be a fiercely independent, uncompromisingly pro-democracy news outlet. And that is what it is. And that is what Paige, you and I try to bring to the viewers in each of these videos, and that you and Democracy Docket bring to all of its content and through all of its channels. So I want to make sure everyone who's watching this, if you are not already a premium member for Democracy Docket, please click on the link below and become a member. It is the best way to support the kind of independent news outlet that Democracy Docket is. If you just want to try it out and you want to join as a free member and get its daily and weekly newsletters, that link below as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode of Democracy Docket. We'll see you next time.